Okay, you guys, we're going to talk a little bit about neuromuscular junctions today. So just remember that we have a nervous system, just a little bit of background that most organisms have a nervous system, although not plants, obviously, and not all animals have what we call a central nervous system. So for example, this cnidarian here, this hydra has a nerve net. This echinoderm has a nerve ring with radial nerves that come out. And we don't really start to see encephalization, which is like a clustering of nerves at the head until we get into this planarian here. See, it has a brain and an eye spot. We see it more developed here in an arthropod, and then very developed in a vertebrate. So again, here we have the division of our nervous system. We have the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. We can further divide our peripheral nervous system, these efferent neurons, into the autonomic nervous system and the motor nervous system. So the motor are like the motor of your muscles, whereas the autonomic is everything else. Your sympathetic, your parasympathetic. This is controlling your heart, your digestive system, your reproductive system, your urinary tract system. All of that is done through your autonomic nervous system. We won't really be studying about parts of the brain, although that's super fascinating. I think I went over a little bit of a reflex arc when we did our discussion, if you join me in the Google Meets, but if not, a reflex arc does not require central nervous system processing. And that's really just because evolutionarily, we don't have time to send the message to the brain and the spinal cord. We need to react almost immediately. So you see that you have some type of stimuli. This could be the reflex hammer on your knee. It could be if you touch something hot or you touch something cold. And so immediately that sensation is going to be picked up. It's going to be processed in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And then it's immediately going to be sent to your muscle neurons, your motor neurons, to pull that muscle away. It is processed here in this interneuron, and then eventually it sends it to your brain. But if you've ever noticed, if you've accidentally put your hand on something that's hot, you've pulled away by the time your brain realizes that it's hot. And so that's your reflex arc. And so here you can see that this afferent neuron splits, and it sends a message to the interneuron, and it sends a message to that efferent neuron so that it's going to have that motor response. We're not going to go through parts of the brain. That's super fascinating, but we just don't really have time. So I'm going to skip through here. And I'm going to see if I can find, we talked a little bit about these things. I'm going to see if I can find muscle system stuff. Okay, so again, we have three types of muscles. We have smooth muscle, which is found in your gastrointestinal system. It's found in your reproductive system. We have skeletal muscle. This is how you move. And then we have cardiac muscle of your heart. And so only the skeletal muscle is under your control. Everything else is done in the brain stem. That's how you kind of have somebody that's a vegetable. So the brain stem is intact. All their functions are working, but we don't have any higher level processing, and we don't have any movement because that's the thing that's under control. Okay, so muscles do two things. They can contract and they can relax. So, I should have worn a different thing. So right now my muscle is relaxed, and then when I bend my arm, my muscle contracts. So you don't really need to know a whole lot of the structure, but we have this sarcomere here. And if you look, the sarcomere really moves like this. Like, your muscles don't move in very many directions. They pretty much are relaxed, or they can contract, or they relax, or they contract. They don't really do, they can't move in other directions. If they do, you'll tear them. But so here we can see that they're relaxed. There is some overlap between the thin filaments of the Z section and your M sections here. But when they're contract, there's full overlapping between the Z and the M. Okay, so again, here we see that it's flexed, and here we see that it's relaxed. And so they work antagonistically with one another. Typically, we have some muscle structure. So here you see an example. Here's a muscle. All of the muscle are going to come together to form a muscle fiber. And then here we see, let me go back. Here you see we have different sections. So we have these thick filaments. These are made out of myosin, and the thin filaments are made out of actin. They have different parts. Here we see the Z line and we see the sarcomere. The sarcomere is the unit of the muscle. And so what happens is when your brain says it's time to move, then there is a nerve. Let me see if I can find a different picture. Yeah, okay. So basically what happens is in order to contract, this thick filament that's in purple is going to go up and attach to the thin filament in yellow, and then it's going to pull. And so we'll talk about this. This is called the sliding filament theory. But so what happens is once your body says to move the muscle, the thick filament has these heads on them. We call them myosin heads. And right now they have ATP. Right now you see that there are little binding spots on this myosin thin filament. I'm sorry, on the actin thin filament, we call them myosin binding sites. So here we see that once they become available, the myosin head will reach up and it will actually attach to the actin. So at this point in step 3, the actin and the myosin are actually bound together. So if I start at step 1, here's my myosin head. It is not attached. Notice that it's not touching this actin filament. Once it is able, the myosin binding site will become open, and that myosin head will reach up and it will attach to the myosin binding site, and then it's going to contract, and that's what pulls your muscle. So all these heads attach and then they pull, the energy is released, and they come back off and we start all over again. So what we really care here is that is that there's a head, it attaches, and then it pulls, and then it contracts, and then it pulls, and it contracts. And so it goes back and forth, and we call that the sliding filament theory. And the reason we're talking about this is that normally the myosin is not available. If you notice here, you see all these little myosin binding spots. I don't know that you can see. Hold on one second. So you can see all of these little binding sites. Let me see if I can draw. So you can see all of these myosin binding sites here. And so we're going to talk about those. That's what we're talking about. And so what will happen is, I think I just screwed this up now. Okay. What will happen is, oh man. Okay. That head needs to bind to the myosin binding sites, but it's not always available. If you notice, sometimes these purple things, they're called myosin site blockers. They're called troponin. And so this troponin blocks the myosin. So when your muscles they receive that action potential that the nerve sends an action potential to your muscle, and it releases that calcium. Remember how we're going to convert that electrical signal into a chemical signal? When that electrical signal comes down, the calcium begins to flood in, and then the neurotransmitters are released. Well, in this case, that neurotransmitter causes these calcium molecules to bind to the troponin, that moves the troponin out of the way, and so the myosin binding site is now exposed and the head can attach. So this is the signal between the nervous system reaching the muscular system and saying, hey, you need to contract. And so this is what we're talking about, because this is a really specific ligand that binds to a protein that moves it out of the way so that the muscle head can start to contract. So it's just a really cool example of the cell communication. So if we take a further look at this, we can see the whole picture. So here it is, it's coming down. Acetylcholine is actually the nervous system, the motor neuron, the neurotransmitter that's used. So acetylcholine is released from the neuron. That travels down through this T tube. Once that's released, the calcium begins to be released through the ion-gated channels, binds to the troponin binding complex that moves it out of the way. The myosin is now available. The head attaches and we see contraction, and then the whole process starts all over again. So that's how your muscles are directed to move by the nervous system. So I would just know generally, right? The the acetylcholine is released by the nerve that causes calcium to be released. The myosin binding site becomes available because troponin is moved out of the way, and then the muscle contracts. Okay, that's kind of all I got for this one. It's just a really very cool example of muscle contraction and cell communication in your body. So you have a little Google Slides thing to fill out, and that will be it for today.